We had, excellent. Thank you. Good evening. It's so nice to have so many people here. Welcome to the Metro Climate Action Team, MCAT, a special webinar to introduce the new book by Dr. John Perona, From Knowledge to Power. My name is Jane Stackhouse, and I'm a member of the MCAT Steering Committee. We are a community of experienced volunteers working with OLCV to steward significant greenhouse gas reduction policy in Oregon. We meet regularly with our legislators with the goal of making each of them a climate champion. When Governor Brown issued the Executive Order 2004 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we joined the Oregon Climate Action Plan Coalition. Working with this environmental justice coalition, we're now monitoring agency progress toward accomplishing and exceeding Oregon's greenhouse gas reduction goals. Some of our members, like Dr. Perona, who we usually call John, are experts in climate science. Others, like myself, are concerned about climate change and still have a lot to learn. All are welcome in MCAT. It's a great place to learn and take action. As participants in this webinar, you will be able to ask questions of Dr. Perona by using the Q&A function. Just hover over the margin of your screen for the Q&A to display and type your question. I will be moderating the questions during the question and answer section. I may kind of summarize some of them and we'll be combining some. So if you don't hear your exact question, that would be why. The chat will be available to view information from the panelists, and we will be putting information in there on contact information and how to order the book. To wrap up our evening, Brittany Van Sitters from OLCV will share with us an action. We have to remember, as we hear about climate change and think about it, it can be overwhelming, but direct action is a way to combat that. Now I'll hand off to another member of the MCAT Steering Committee, KB Mercer, who will introduce Dr. John Perona. KB?
Hello, everybody. I am delighted to introduce John Perona to you today. John brings expertise in scientific research, environmental law, and education to address how advances in science and engineering can be incorporated into policymaking and advocacy. His specialties are climate change, the transition to a renewable energy economy, and biotechnology. John was educated in chemical engineering at Rutgers, molecular biophysics and biochemistry at Yale, and law at Lewis and Clark University and Santa Barbara College of Law. His professional experience includes 27 years of leading a prolific laboratory, which is presently funded by NASA and the National Institutes of Health. He and his students have recently made significant progress in understanding the metabolism of methanogens, which are microorganisms that generate much of the anthropogenic methane causing global heating. Since 1990, he has worked at Yale, UC San Francisco, and UC Santa Barbara. And for the past 10 years, he has served as full professor in the chemistry department at Portland State University and as an adjunct professor at OHSU. John has authored over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles and has prepared legal materials and briefs against gas pipeline development on the East Coast and against LNG facilities on the Oregon coast. Many of the people attending today may remember John for the fantastic series of lectures and presentations he gave a few years ago on climate change science and policy, which educated so many local activists. I've been looking forward to reading his new book, From Knowledge to Power, since I heard he was writing one. I met John about 8 years ago now as a fellow volunteer with the Citizens Climate Lobby. John has the important job of being the CCL liaison to Senator Ron Wyden, who as chair of the Senate Finance Committee plays a central role in carbon pricing considerations. Several times now, John and I have checked each other's teeth for spinach and dusted off each other's shoulders before heading into Wyden's office in DC, where I played Robin to his Batman, taking furious notes as John masterfully made the case for carbon fee and dividend. I am truly delighted to introduce someone I really admire and a friend who is a kick to hang out and have a drink with, Dr. John Perona. Take it away, John.
Thanks so much, KB. It's great to be here. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and special thanks to MCAT for sponsoring this webinar for me. I'm going to share my screen and take it off from here. Okay, so I want to start tonight. Often, you know, we scientists put our thank yous at the end of a talk, but that's not going to cut it tonight, because really this book would not have happened were it not for my many friends in the advocacy community. And I want to start by thanking Tamara Staten, who's on staff at CCL, the Northwest Regional Coordinator, Danella and Francine, and who are running the show in Oregon for CCL, and my many other CCL volunteer friends, including KB, and many others who are either on this call or many of you may know. If it were not for that work, I don't think that I would have been able to put the book together. My other heartfelt thanks goes to the Oregon climate advocacy community, and I want to single out especially the MCAT transportation team, led by Rich and Jane, that I've been privileged to serve on for some period of time in the past year. I really think, and this is something we can talk about, that the way that the MCAT teams are organized in Oregon to make the work happen should be a model for climate advocacy in other states as well. So I have many other people to thank. Folks at the Environmental Defense Center at Santa Barbara got me first started understanding something about environmental law, and first whetted my appetite for advocacy. The law faculty at Lewis and Clark was just tremendous. They're the best in the field. And I also want to thank Ethan Seltzer for really giving me sound advice about how to start the publishing process at a time when I knew virtually nothing, because I read a lot of articles and no books until now. And Steve Gahn, who is a CCLer and works at PNNL, has spent a career in climate science and read pretty much the whole book and brought his advice and his insights into making that happen. And finally, I want to say that the student publishing team at Hooligan Press, which is the publisher, some of you may not know about Hooligan, but it's a remarkable publishing house run by students under faculty supervision at PSU. And I can say that their work, especially in the editing process, was really remarkable and helped make the book assume its final form. So I'm dedicating the book to the young people in my life, and I also want to shout out to my family. And this is I just had the good fortune when I was growing up to be able to visit the Italian Alps many times. These photographs are from a trip that I took right before the pandemic. It was summer of 2019. And so on the bottom here is the ancestral hometown that my great-grandmother lived in, and I got to visit her as a child there. But what we see here, so on the upper right, we have a mountain goat, an ibex. It's called Stambecco in Italian. This is a high alpine region, and it's very fragile and it's susceptible to climate change. The glaciers are melting, the water streams are changing, the invasive species are coming in. This environment is at serious risk right now. And it was a motivator for me to get into it in the environmental work. And so I very much want to preserve it for future generations. So that's just a little bit of how I came to this where I am now in terms of dedicating a lot of effort into climate advocacy. So I'm going to talk about the book for a little while, and then I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to summarize where we are with climate and what are the challenges going forward. Okay, so this book is really a book for serious advocates, and the premise of the book is that knowledge builds confidence and persuasive ability. And I would say that the combination of confidence and persuasive ability adds up to power, empowerment of individuals who will go into lawmakers' offices, offices of business and community leaders and faith leaders, and make the case for aggressive action to combat climate change. So the book has basically three elements to it. It's written for advocates primarily, and the three elements are science and energy technology, public policy and politics, and resources and advice for advocacy. So the advocacy pieces are intertwined in the whole narrative. So it's a continuous integrated narrative. There's about 100 pages on climate science, and then it goes into policy and politics. And the idea of the book is, one part of the idea of the book is that it's comprehensive. And so I haven't been able to find any other resource, any other book out there that covers anything like this kind of territory for layperson advocates. You don't need a background in any kind of climate work to read the book effectively. So what do I mean by comprehensive? This is a list of the topics in the book, or partial list of the topics in the book. And as I say, I start with the science aspect. This is a continuous narrative. It starts from first principles and it integrates the denialist arguments. So Michael Mann has written a number of good books on climate denialism. There's a skeptical science website where you can get all your answers. If there's anything unique here about the denialist treatment, it's that it's embedded in the science. So that as I explain the basics of how a climate works here, as it comes up, I say, well, this is where the denialists are coming in. So hopefully that kind of treatment helps understanding of where they're coming from, and may assist in remembering how to counter those arguments. So there's science, there's policy solutions. So carbon pricing gets its own chapter because I feel that it's really foundational in determining the success of all other policies. And then there are separate chapters on electricity, industry, building, cities, transportation. It's sort of titled Carbon-Free Lifestyles. And then a chapter on carbon removal, which covers both forests and farms and industrial scale vacuuming of the atmosphere. I'll come back to this point. And then sort of along the way, there are extra chapters on the fossil fuel industry, describing what are their business models. Their business models are collapsing, thanks to a lot of strong advocacy work in part. And, but what are they trying to do about it? And how can advocates act in that area? And then there's also a chapter on roadmaps for the energy transition. There's quite a number of maps that describe in some detail what we should be doing to get to the goal, which is net zero emissions by 2050. So let me tell you a little bit about the advocacy section, since we're all advocates. This is an outline of chapter 5, which is the dedicated advocacy chapter. So I start here with explaining for the benefit of folks who advocate a back to nature solution, why it is that we have to rely on technology to solve the problem. After that section, I talk about the landscape for climate advocacy. This little section here, 2 Faces of Climate Advocacy, is a short narrative that describes a fateful day in November 2018, right after the election where the Democrats won the House of Representatives. And it turned out that CCL, including myself, and probably KB was there, and Sunrise was there having a sit-in in the office of Speaker-to-be Nancy Pelosi. And so we were crashing each other in the halls of the Senate and House that day. So a little piece about that. Some description of the eco-right advocacy groups from more of the conservative part of the spectrum, the progressives part of the spectrum, treatment of equity and climate policy, and then a longer narrative on practical strategies for advocacy resources. What are we really going to, what resources do we have to bring to bear? And those of you who have done, for example, the climate reality training, or have been involved with CCL for some time, and I'm sure other groups as well, will recognize a lot of the strategies and advice in that part of the chapter. And then for the rest of the book, where I get into the policy and such, examples and opportunities for advocacy are just embedded in that. So for example, the electricity power chapter talks about all the possible power sources that we could use to get to net zero in 2040. What are the policy solutions? How does the grid work? And as it comes up, well, here's what advocates could do. So it's sort of embedded in the narrative in that way. This is just a picture from a table from chapter 5 that shows, my idea of categorizing many of the groups that are out in the landscape. I distinguished the progressive groups, which are grassroots, from Big Green. Big Green is basically distinguished by having a lot of money and going to Washington and lobbying, and they do a tremendous amount of good work, but they're less on the grassroots side. And I also think it's important, and this is part of what I hope is the appeal of the book, to as broad a community in America as possible, that we include the full spectrum of political orientations of the groups, including the eco-right. The Climate Leadership Council has proposed a carbon tax that's only a little bit less aggressive than the one we advocate at CCL. And some of these groups, it is true, do not advocate full solutions, but they are a far cry from the denialists. And so I took the position that it is better to engage these folks than to leave them out. And that's very much coming from my experience with advocating with CCL, which of course does the same thing. So from here, let me just show you one more description of what the book covers. I picked methane because I know that this is a topic that's coming up here in Oregon, the control of methane emissions. It's also getting attention in Glasgow right now. So dispersed throughout the book is material on methane that covers all these different aspects of it, right? The basic science, how potent is it as a greenhouse gas? What was its history on Earth? Feedback loops, for example, the potential melting of the permafrost could release large amounts of methane. How much should we worry about that? The sources of methane, and then pieces on what we could do policy-wise. Should we regulate it? Should we rely on a free market approach? What are the pros and cons of those approaches? And what can technology do for us, right? And so embedded again in this sort of narrative is or explanations that, or ideas for how advocates can work, limiting new infrastructure with natural gas and early retirement of existing natural gas plants. I'll come back to this too. So this is a header from the website, and I just want to emphasize what distinguishes the book from other titles, because there are so many climate books out there, and I think that anyone who wants to write a book on climate had better face the question of how is it going to be a unique contribution. And so the header on the website says, for ordinary citizens with extraordinary commitments. And by this, I mean that it's not necessarily going to be a piece of cake to learn everything we need to learn about climate science to be effective in advocacy. A little bit of effort will be required. And so that's the sense of extraordinary commitment. So I start from first principles. I don't assume anything. I make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. But I do explain from first principles. There's no summary of material that's just sort of giving you bottom lines and say, just believe this here. It's really coming from the basic principles of science. And that takes a little bit longer to explain. And some of it may take a couple of readings. But I am confident from the seminar series I gave here in Oregon and other advocacy work that I've done, that there's a real hunger out there for the depth of knowledge that I hope that this book provides. I think it's also useful as a supplemental text for college classes. There are a very large number of notes, so the book can sort of function as a portal to get out there into the literature. And I would love it if we could get the book into the hands of organizations and governments so that they too have this resource available to them. So it's not like other genres of climate books, and some folks may want to start with other kinds of books. And I recommend on the website, I've got a bookshelf that goes through some of this. But I certainly recommend books by journalists like The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, because they can activate caring among people who really want to make a difference and just need to get in touch with that. There are many other books. The book by Catherine Hayhoe is wonderful. I'm just in the middle of reading it. There are stories, there are explanations, there is motivation. For folks who are not sure that they want to dive in, these books are the place to start. Right? If you are sure that you want to dive in, then K2P, the acronym for it, which was given by the students at Hooligan Press, by the way, and I love it, so I'm going to keep using it. That may be the right book. And I can also distinguish K2P from this book on the right, for example, Deeper Dives. We're doing all of climate science in this book in 300 pages. So needless to say, and they're not, they're relatively densely packed pages, but we can't cover everything. And so deeper dives are important for those who want to focus on particular areas. So this book on the power grid is an example of that. It's a really remarkable book. What you won't find on the website are recommendations for books that are skeptical narratives, like from Bjorn Lomborg, for example, or doomsday narratives, like from David Wallace Wells, for example. Those two kinds of books, of which there are many, have one thing in common, and that is the message that you don't need to act, either because it's not a big problem or because we're doomed, so what's the point? Right? So very much the books that I'm recommending are those that we can use to motivate action. So let me finish off this this part of the talk by just acknowledging that as an advocate myself, I found that as I was writing this, I could not take a completely dispassionate academic point of view, and that because I advocate for carbon pricing and I tried to dive as deep as I could into all the technologies, I found that all of these approaches are useful. And so the book is basically giving an admissions-centered approach. It's focusing a lot more on mitigation than adaptation, for example. And the rubric could be all of the above except fossil fuels. And I try to give messages to progressives and more conservative members of the community who may want to join in. Right. And so certainly equity is central to the conversation, and the book describes why that is and how our policy should follow from equitable considerations. And that's not just about because it's the right thing to do, it's because it will actually provide a better result. But also, the book is basically saying, please make space for all solutions to this existential problem. Compromise is not a dirty word. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I actually think that the stance of progressives in the House of Representatives now, as the reconciliation drama continues to unfold, they've actually acquitted themselves quite well in this regard, perhaps better than some of the moderates have. Conservatives should know that there's a lot of money to be made in renewable energy. Right. As advocates, we don't have to necessarily talk about climate. We can get them on our side by emphasizing that solar and wind, et cetera, are great business opportunities. And also that there's no way we're going to have an effective policy that's going to work in the long term if it does not include making fossil fuel communities whole. Right. And so that is also part of the reconciliation bill. So that's all I wanted to say about the book. Well, one more slide. I wanted to just point out the website. You already have the website, Earl, but just to give you a sense of what you can find on the website, guides to climate action and information in these 3 areas of science, solutions, and advocacy, which are the 3 areas of the book, and all these sort of other aspects of the book that you might be interested in. And also the website is my opportunity to keep the book updated. This blog introduces me and the book, and you just heard this lecture, so you probably don't need to read this blog with any right away, but this blog here, it describes everything that's happening on the federal level since President Biden took office. And you note the date, I posted this 2 months ago, and I'm waiting for reconciliation to come out so that we know what we've got, and then I will update the post again. So I have other planned updates on the science and other aspects of the book, and those should be coming over time. And there's a book launch November 30th for anyone who wants to come out. It's a lucky lab. We'll have a party. We'll talk about the book a little bit. And it's a brew pub, so we'll have a good time there. If you are in an advocacy group and you would like a copy for your group, just let me know and I'll be happy to send a copy out to you free of charge. Okay, so where are we today in climate? And what can I say? We live in interesting times. So this is the Global Carbon Project's report. It just came out last week. This is where the climate science community goes for reliable information on everything to do with the carbon cycle, including the anthropogenic inputs to the carbon cycle in the form of CO2 and methane. And so what we see here is that in 2021, this is still a projection, but they've been pretty accurate in their projections in the past. We're pretty much back to the 2019 level of emissions. And these are global fossil carbon dioxide emissions. This is just CO2 here. So we see we had a big drop, but we have a rise now that's almost as big. So this is probably not surprising to anyone. We knew this was coming. Now we have the actual reliable numbers from the definitive source. So what is going on at Glasgow? What is the story on global emissions and where are we at? So the United Nations just put out their yearly emissions gap report. There have been a very, very large number of new analyses. International Energy Agency came out with another one recently. Lots and lots of energy modeling groups and think tanks are coming out with models for this or that policy scenario. Last summer in 2020, the US House of Representatives put out the very first climate plan that any congressional body in the US had ever put out. And there's a comprehensive model for that, which shows that it's good enough to get to net zero emissions by 2050. But on this slide, what we're looking at here is where are we at with our current policies, and that's here in brown. And so there's 2 messages here. One message is we're not doing enough yet. We haven't pledged enough. We don't know if the pledges are even going to be met or not. If all the pledges are currently met, the estimate, and this is pretty close to other estimates, is that we'll have a 2/3 chance of having a 2.8 degrees C increased world in the year 2100. There's some new pledges. There aren't too many new ones compared to where we were 4 or 5 years ago. But they bring us down just a little bit. So not good enough, clearly. If we add in the net zero targets, so enough countries that represent about half of world emissions have now made pledges for net zero. And if those were all met, we would have a 2.2 degrees C world in 2100. So none of these scenarios yet are in the range that we need them to be, as indicated by these curves here. Right. So that's the first message. There is, however, another message. It's not getting emphasized very much, and that's appropriate because we need to hold lawmakers' feet to the fire very much. But the other message is that we have bent the curve a lot in the last decade or so. So this is the projection from 2010 policies, and this is the projection from 2021 policies. This is the current policy scenario. So it used to be not long ago that the outlier scenarios were projecting 4 and 5 degrees C of global warming. Now the projections are for somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees C of global warming. So that is, of course, not good enough. And that could be a very tragic future world if we end up there. But I think we should still acknowledge that there's been a very substantial amount of progress in the past decade already. So those are the two messages really coming from Glasgow and other modeling groups. So what about the United States? What are we pledging as our contribution? Right. So our emissions peaked at in 2005, and they've dropped about 17% up to last year. And so now our pledges come in these 3 increments to 2025, 2030, and to net zero in 2050. The steepest drop here is getting to 50 to 52% of our 2005 emissions in 2030. And this is our contribution that President Biden has brought to the Glasgow talks. Right. So okay, this is what we're saying we want to do. And the question then is, though, how are we going to do it? Right. And so that brings us to the reconciliation bill. So the 2 marquee policies in the reconciliation bill are, or in part were, the Clean Electricity Payment Program, which is gone thanks to Senator Manchin. Unfortunately, Senator Manchin does not like subsidizing electric utilities for their use of renewable energy. So that was a significant policy that we don't have anymore. However, Bloomberg reported yesterday that a carbon tax, and we don't know how high of a carbon tax, we don't know how effective yet, how aggressive it's going to be. But they reported yesterday that 49 of 50 senators are on board for a carbon tax. And the House has said, Nancy Pelosi has said that if the Senate passes that, they would include it. And the president has said that if the House and Senate pass it, that he would sign it. So we're 1 senator away. I leave it to your imagination to guess which senator that is. It's the same one who opposed the Clean Electricity Payment Program. So a high carbon tax, an escalating tax, aggressive tax, even if you do not include gasoline in it. You see, there's only a very small difference if you exclude gasoline from it, and that makes it more politically palatable. But this is modeling from Resources for the Future. This is the most effective policy. We've known it for a long time. And so they're in the last stretch now in DC. And Senator Wyden is a champion for this policy. It's all coming out of his finance committee. He's the chair of the finance committee. So if you want to take another action besides the one you'll hear about at the end of the talk, please call Senator Wyden, call Senator Merkley, call your representative in the House and ask them to include an aggressive carbon tax in the reconciliation bill. So what if we don't get the carbon tax? This modeling study from the Rhodium Group says that we can meet the US pledge anyway if we use these policies. The clean energy tax credits and the clean energy spending, of which is huge in this bill. These seem pretty secure in the bill, and these are the top 2 pillars. Paired with aggressive federal regulations, that's problematic given that the Supreme Court is going to review an important case brought by West Virginia on whether the Clean Air Act can regulate carbon dioxide emissions. But then the last piece is U.S. state and corporate initiatives. So that takes us to the states. We have a great climate action plan here in Oregon, and we passed our marquee bill, HB 2021, an emissions-based standard for clean electricity with these targets: 100% below baseline by 2040. That's I don't know, is it the most aggressive policy in the country? It's more aggressive than California or Washington. But will we get there? Right? We have this in the law, so doesn't that mean we have to get there? And unfortunately, the law also contains this section, Section 9, the reliability clause. Public utility commissions, which regulate utilities and have conversations with them about whether their plans are good enough or not, they may investigate whether to grant an exemption to compliance under this law or under the renewable portfolio standard for that matter. And they might grant an exemption if we can't meet reliability, right? We result in rates that are not fair and reasonable. So, PGE goes to the Public Utilities Commission and says, we could shut down our natural gas fired power plant because that's the only way that we can meet the law. But if we do, guess what? We risk reliability and rates are going to go up, right? So this is where we need to be paying attention, I think. And so what are the challenges? So one challenge is allocation of land. This doesn't get as much attention as it should. This is from this modeling is from the Princeton Net Zero America study, which is probably the most comprehensive of all the energy models, all the modeling to get us to net zero. This is under two different scenarios, one of which they're both electrification intensive, but this one is also renewable intensive and does not use nuclear power. So this is the amount of land that's visually impacted in 2050 by renewable energy facilities, solar and wind farms. And if you exclude nuclear power, this is the amount of land that's impacted. Now, these are visual impacts. Certainly, wind farms have to place their windmills a third or a half a mile apart. That can be mixed use land. It's not like this whole land is dedicated to wind and solar and nothing else. In fact, only small fractions of these areas have to be taken up by the renewable facilities. Nonetheless, visual impact is a very significant consideration for folks who oppose this development, right? And it's the processes associated with allocating the land sometimes take longer than they should. I'm just going to say it like that. But it's definitely a bottleneck. It's addressed in this study. So you can see here why I advocate for at least maintaining our nuclear power. We can get rid of it later, but if we don't, then we're really in a position where we're going to have much more land impacted. We have much more problems with land allocation. And because we don't have a baseline source, if it's all solar and wind or mostly solar and wind, then it's going to be a lot more costly to put energy storage into the grid. So another bottleneck is transmission, building a better grid. There are some promising signs for this. The infrastructure bill that came out included authority for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to permit electricity transmission corridors. So that's a first step. They used to be able to be overruled by the states. Now they have more authority, but that's just one step. Okay. I recommend looking at the website for Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. If you don't know this group, they're I think the premier advocacy group that's pushing for cleaning up the grid. And we have other issues as well. A lot of folks are worried about solar tariffs of materials coming in for solar panels, supply of rare metals for materials to make solar panels, et cetera. So let me close then. Those are the issues that I think we need to be paying attention to. We need to be paying close attention to what is going on with the Public Utilities Commission. What are the utilities doing? We don't want Section 9 calls, right? We want to be out in front of these issues in terms of building solar and wind and shutting down natural gas, right? We've got rid of Boardman, but that was also a process that PGE started 10 years ahead, right? We don't really have that kind of time anymore. We've got 6 or 7 or 8 large natural gas-fired power plants. This is one of them in the state. What should we do in terms of getting them shut down on time to meet the emissions targets? Should we retrofit them with carbon capture? That's going to be a question that I think is likely to come up going forward. And if we did that, it would be mitigation, right? It would be a way to capture. It would be a way to keep the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, capture it, trap it, liquefy it, pipe it to safe underground geological storage facilities. right? So this kind of, this is mitigation, but other kinds of work like forests and farms, burying carbon on the land, right, or industrial processes are important to help us achieve net zero, right? All these countries are pledging net zero now, and they're relying on, in part, on having just a little bit of emissions in 2050, but we're going to compensate for that with, say, natural land management, forests and farms. But what about net negative, right? This whole issue of, should we capture the carbon from natural gas plants, right? This is CCS technology, right? And CCS technology is used not just to capture streams from power plants, but also to capture carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, right? So no countries are making net negative pledges yet, right? But this raises the question of what is the carbon dioxide level that's actually safe, right? And so in the last interglacial period, before the last ice age, the Earth was pretty similar to what it is now. This is in geological time, this is a drop in the bucket, right? All the continents were in the same place, all the oceans were the same, right? At that time, the temperature was 1 degree higher, but there was less than 300 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's very reliable proxy data suggesting that the sea level then was 20 or 30 feet higher than it is now. And this is with 300 ppm CO2, right? There's evidence for rapid Antarctic ice melt. And so, we need to ask, what is the safe CO2 level? We're going to be getting to, best case scenario, 450 ppm if we sharply reduce emissions. That'll be approximately where we level off to. It's 450 ppm and a temperature increase of somewhere between, say, 1.5 and 2 degrees. Are we going to sit there and wait for geologic time to remove that excess carbon dioxide, or are we going to vacuum it out of the atmosphere? And I very much think, and this is the last chapter of the book, that we need to be paying a lot more attention to that. So we would all like to rely on forests and farms, and of course we have an aggressive advocacy here in Oregon to make sure that our forests are healthy. But there are an increasing number of studies suggesting that there are just natural limits to how much carbon can really be sequestered on the land. It's going to plateau off. And that's not even thinking about things like wildfires, which are going to take carbon off the land. So we probably need to move to industrial approaches. The Department of Energy recognizes this. There's a whole new initiative around investing in research dollars to build up these technologies. Direct air capture is definitely the most important one. And here are some of the policies. We can talk about what policies we should use for carbon capture, right? But for sure, for mitigation, we need aggressive carbon capture for cement manufacturing, for steel making, for fertilizer manufacturing. We don't have alternatives now. We need these products for our economy. We don't have any other way to mitigate the emissions yet. We don't have an alternative technology. We need to capture that. And as we do that, the technology, the chemistry of capturing the carbon from a smokestack is the same chemistry as it is capturing from the atmosphere. So we can hope that the innovation in this process will bring prices down, right, for that technology to under $100 per ton of buried CO2. This is an important issue. It includes advocacy issues, includes issues like, is there some moral hazard? I see fossil fuel companies like carbon capture. Does that mean that I shouldn't like it, et cetera? So the last chapter of the book sort of goes into this. So I'm just going to leave you with that. Thanks so much for your attention, and I am happy to take questions.
Thank you, John. We have a number of questions, and I'm going to try to group them sort of on related topics to help with the transition along this. One of the questions we had about your book is, will your book be distributed to universities? Carol Yarborough thinks the University of Oregon would have a lot of interest.
I certainly hope so. But as of right now, I don't have, this is something I could discuss with the publisher, but we don't have an action plan for getting the book to all the major universities. Of course, I have folks I know at many universities. I'm reaching out to them, but that's kind of hit and miss, right? So I would be very much grateful if anybody wanted to help out with figuring out how we can get it to universities, and not to mention the legislature. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Pam Nichols has a book that she likes, that she says is a beautiful novel, The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. She's wondering if you've read it and if you recommend it.
I have not finished it, but I have started it. It's heartbreaking, really, because it starts in India with a massive heat event with very substantial loss of life, and it goes on from there. But yes, it's a great narrative. It's written sort of a bit scientific terms, and I like that as a scientist. But yes, I recommend that.
Moving away from the book, we have a question from Tim Miller. First, he says, thank you, John. I'm curious about what you think about the importance of knowledge and information or reason in persuasion versus the role of empathy, storytelling, anecdotes, empathizing with the opposition, more people-centric approaches. Yeah.
I should have made that a little clearer, but I'm grateful for the chance to expound a bit on it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the human connection with whomever we're lobbying or speaking with about climate is the single most important thing to establish straight off. The last thing you want to do is hit people with a lot of facts when you don't know what their concerns are and where they're coming from and what their political orientation is, et cetera. So, I really recommend Catherine Hayhoe's book for this, her recent book, because it talks about reaching common ground first. And that's a message that many of the advocacy groups, I think, are delivering. And then once you have that, right, you have your facts in reserve. You know what you want to accomplish, right? You're not saying, you're probably not going in there saying, we want net zero in 2050, make it happen. You're specifically talking about, this forest, this resource plan, this wind farm, right? Shutting down this natural gas fired power plant. And so that's where, if you are prepared with information, you will be more effective in your advocacy. You'll be confident, you'll be able to be persuasive, you'll see where the other side is making flawed arguments, and in an empathetic way, you will be able to gently make your effective points.
Right, thank you. There's several people who have questions about the nuclear option.
Okay.
Bob Robinson says he can agree that it's part of the solution, but he's concerned about waste disposal. Senator Frederick is online with us tonight. Nice to see you here, Senator Frederick. And he would like to know more about what this nuclear option could be. Would it be present plants or SMRs? So again, I'm going to learn something from him when we find out what an SMR is. And there was one other one I'm finding here that was along that same line. Can we safely do this?
Yeah. So SMR stands for Small Modular Reactor. So Oregon is actually taking the lead. There's a company called NuScale. It's out of Corvallis, and I guess they have other locations as well. And the permitting for that is actually well along. The NRC has granted the safety permits for these. And there's groups there's a group in Idaho, I know, that is pursuing construction of one of these facilities. So those are smaller. They'll use less fissionable material, less uranium, but they will still, of course, cause the waste problem. And I agree, we have a waste problem, and Congress has not been able to deal with it. Nobody wants the nuclear waste pile in their backyard. That's understandable. Yucca Mountain seemed like a good solution to me, but thanks to Senator Harry Reid in Nevada and the present Nevada senators, I don't think we're going to see that. On the other hand, we have to compare the damages from climate change to the potential hazard from nuclear waste disposal. The nuclear power plants in this country, even the big ones that nobody is advocating for continuing for building new ones of, at most we're gonna advocate for subsidies to keep them running a little bit longer, so that we keep that baseload power. Nobody's arguing that we should be keeping those big nuclear power plants, but the smaller ones, I think, definitely have a place in our energy future. And as I mentioned in the talk, the reason that they're important right now is that we don't have good long-term energy storage options on the grid. And as we get closer and closer to 100% renewable, the storage costs go way up. And so that's a very good argument, I think, for keeping nuclear in the mix, at least until over the next couple of decades, we get to net zero. And then certainly we should think about getting rid of it.
And James Carroll has kind of a follow-up to this, asking about, on the other end of the spectrum, what about fusion power? Would that be a means to address both energy demands and climate impacts?
Sure, if we could do it. There has been some recent attention to fusion, but I'm afraid that the old joke still applies, that it's always 40 years away. The new physicist starts his career and is asked about nuclear power. He says 40 years away. He's about to retire. What about nuclear fusion? It's 40 years away. I think there's been some progress in the research. It's not going to happen fast enough for us to make a difference, to make a difference here. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few technologies, in the fusion category that I think we should be investing in. Tidal power, enhanced geothermal systems, but they're not going to come online soon enough to help us.
Mm-hmm. All right. I see lots of questions related to political action here, but before we get off to those, there was a question about, please help us better understand CCS, the carbon capture and storage.
Sure. So there's a well-known reaction of carbon dioxide with a class of chemical compounds called amines. And so the smokestack gases coming out of a coal-fired power plant, a natural gas-fired power plant, or any manufacturing process that generates a lot of CO2, like cement making, contain, I don't know, 10, 15%, maybe roughly, CO2. And that's a pretty high percentage of CO2 in the air, right? Compared to what you have in the atmosphere, which is presently 420 parts per million. So with that concentrated stream, you as the gas comes out of the smokestack, you trickle down solutions with this other chemical, and that reacts with the carbon dioxide, and it allows trapping of it, and eventually that process you can compress it, liquefy it, pipe it to underground storage facilities. And there have been many studies. So we would need to build out the CO2 pipeline infrastructure a lot more than we have. But there have been a lot of studies showing that, especially in the United States, we have enormous capacity in underground reservoirs to store the CO2. And all the pilot studies, which have been considerable, seem to suggest that it's safe. It's not escaping. It's not popping out of there. And so I think it's very important as mitigation. Not so much in electric power plants like natural gas power plants, because if you let them use CCS, then they're taking market share away from wind and solar. And as long as they're operating, you've got the methane leak problem on top of the fact that they're probably not capturing 100% of the CO2. Maybe they'll capture 90% of it. So it's still dirty. On the other hand, capturing 90% of the CO2 out of fertilizer and steelmaking and cement is a big deal. And we don't have any alternative right now. So we should be pushing that technology in those industries using things like the tax credits that Senator Wyden is going to enact for us. And then the development of that technology the economies of scale will bring the costs down. We'll hopefully get technological innovation on the chemistry, the kinds of membranes, all the chemical engineering associated with that process. And then that can be incorporated into the direct air capture systems while we do research on those. So that by the time we get to 2050, that technology is coming online at commercial scale, and we can start to go net negative, hopefully, so that we peak out at 450 and then we start coming down a lot faster than the Earth system would allow us to do. So hopefully that's a nutshell on carbon capture that will help.
Another question we have, Russell Radcliffe felt that you skipped over the natural mitigation a little bit, reforestation and land management. Would you say more on that, particularly in relationship to the carbon capture?
Yeah, well, there's no question that we can use afforestation, planting new forests, reforestation, replanting forests where we had them and they were cut down. The whole eastern United States has been reforested to a remarkable degree in the last few decades. So, and we can do more. There's certainly, there are very good studies out that suggest that if we do not overshoot 1.5 degrees too much, that we can stay within 1.5 degrees using natural land management methods alone. And that would, of course, also include agricultural sequestration, no-tilling practices, lots of different ways to keep carbon in the soil for agriculture. But I'm afraid that, there's studies coming out all the time on this. There's just recently a study about the greening of Europe. If you increase carbon sequestration on land, then you also increase the metabolism that puts it back in the atmosphere. Not as much. It's still drawing things down, but it's sort of like a natural halt on that. And then, of course, we worry about things like wildfires, that can kind of cancel out our progress, with a bad fire year. So, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but and I don't think we should in any way limit our efforts to make sure that we have healthy forests, especially here where we have the old growth forests. And this is land, right? So land implicates so many values beyond climate, right? That's why when we think about using things like biofuels, we need to think not just about climate, but about the principles from the Forest Stewardship Council about biodiversity and principles of indigenous people's rights, et cetera.
I appreciate how you've grasped so much of the system related to this. Lorna Lyons has a question suggestion for something that I've not heard of, so I'm sure that you have. Lorna says she has hope for biomass sequestration, straw bale and hempcrete, and then to use that to be built into highly insulated lime walls where it stays and shift the building industry away from so much embodied carbon into sequestered carbon. Is that a viable solution or something you address in your book?
I don't address that directly. But I think I think it could probably be useful on a small scale, and it's certainly worth looking into and pursuing. But I think that the issues of land use are going to preclude that being sort of a major solution. I do talk about building with wood, which would be not the kind of wood that we need to keep in the forest, but forest thinnings and other kinds of sources where you can replace cement. And cement is a huge CO2 producer, cement manufacturer. So, there are now buildings at 10, 15, 20 stories high that are entirely wood framed. And there's new technology that allows this, and Oregon and Washington are sort of leading the way in terms of looking at making and permitting this sort of stuff. So there's a lot to do in the buildings sector for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Lauren is a fan of this type of building. She says it has good thermal mass that lowers the need for as much operational energy. So that's
I could just point out also though, when Boardman was retired, the coal plant that we have here in Oregon, studies were done to see if it could be converted to a biomass fired plant. And it was decided not to do that, at least in large part because of the supply of biomass was a concern, that it wouldn't be enough. So if there's not enough here in Oregon, I would worry about it being a sort of bigger national solution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Wayne Potter has a question. Is it possible to find ways to replace gas-fired heating systems in households over the next 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely.
Is this
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Is this a useful way to reduce natural gas?
Absolutely. Yeah. I recommend the website Electrify Now, run by a gentleman named Brian Stewart. It's a wonderful site, and it talks about all the options for electrifying your home, all of which are available now, and all of which you can save money on in the long term, because electricity is so efficient compared to natural gas. So in some cases, you still have to pay more for the initial installation. And we hope that things like tax credits coming out of the federal bill will help with that. And Oregon state could probably do more. But yeah, I mean, that's, one of the top things to recommend to folks who want to know, well, what can I do? Electrify your homes and transportation at the first opportunity.
Yes. My heat pumps work well. I'm all for that. Anyone who wants to know how to do it, call me. I'm happy to talk about it, even 2 years later. It still works. Let's see. Let me find. Oh, here's one kind of on the same line of energy. Walt Matinsky has a question. Would you explain to us a little bit more about blue and green hydrogen?
Sure. Hydrogen as made today is neither of those. It's called gray hydrogen, and it's bad because it's made from natural gas. We need a ton of it, unfortunately, to make fertilizer, and we need the fertilizer to grow food for the large population in the world. So these are very important technologies. So gray hydrogen just means burn it, let the CO2 go up. Blue hydrogen means use carbon capture and storage at the hydrogen production facility, so that all that carbon in the natural gas that it got fed in ends up getting captured and buried. This technology is pretty well along. It's known that it's possible to capture, up to 90% of the CO2 going out. But it also still requires building out of the CO2 pipeline and subsidies to get it buried, because, there's some markets for CO2, but they're small, right? I mean, think about, carbonated beverages, think about greenhouses, right? Unfortunately, some of the markets are, get more oil out of the ground by injecting the CO2 into the oil well, pressurize it, and you can get more oil out. Not a great climate solution, to put it mildly. So we need, the whole CCS chain needs to be built out for blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen means make hydrogen from renewable power, like solar or wind energy. And here, what we could do is, eventually the dream is that we get advanced enough in this technology to make hydrogen using solar and wind power. So we know how to do it. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's that it's very expensive and it hasn't been implemented at scale. But the idea would be that the hydrogen that's so made becomes the storage form of energy for the grid, right? Like right now, what's the storage form of energy for the grid? It's natural gas and coal, because these are like solid chemical materials that can be stored and burned whenever we want, right? Transported around. Well, we need something like that. That's a chemical material that can be stored and moved around, that doesn't give us CO2 emissions when we burn it, like hydrogen. So that's green, and that's where we should be. That's what we should be shooting for. But in the meantime, I think we probably need to do some blue.
Thank you. Conrad Eustace has a question about, as we're moving to different kinds of energy, what % mix of wind and solar do most of the plans assume when you're doing those projections for us?
Well, they do. They use different amounts. So in that slide I showed from Princeton Net Zero America, that was 2 different projections. One of them, one with nuclear and one without. And so, can we get there with, it's not going to be 100% wind and solar, but because we've got 7% hydro, a few percent geothermal, a little bit of biomass, right? But most of, we can get there with 90%, or we can keep the nuclear. We can even keep natural gas with CCS, although that's less desirable. But in the long run, we need to get to net zero as soon as possible. Even that would be preferable to where we are now, right? So the answer is that they input whatever they want, right? They can assume higher or lower amounts, but all of them assume a dramatic, rapid build out of wind and solar.
Right, thank you. Sean McCain's story has a question that I keep asking too. Most of the people I know have reduced their carbon footprint since 2019. Where are these increases coming from?
Well, they're coming from all the people who haven't reduced the carbon footprint. And they're coming from countries around the world that unfortunately still rely on coal. So China has now promised not to export any coal projects, which is a good thing, but they haven't promised to stop using it themselves. And so there has been a ramp up in coal in Asia, and that's going to plateau and go down in the next decade or so. But for the time being, we're still burning an awful lot of coal in the world, and that's where a lot of the increases are coming from.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, good questions. I think we're about ready to move into the advocacy political. Catherine Thomason had a question about, we talked about putting a price on carbon. Would a VAT tax, a value added tax, help to reduce imports in the future? Would that be of help?
Sure. I mean, most people think that a carbon tax should be paired with a border carbon adjustment so that if there are imports from countries that don't tax carbon, we hit them with a tariff. And similarly, if our manufacturers export a carbon-rich good to a country that doesn't have a carbon tax or has a low carbon tax, then our manufacturers should get a rebate so that they can be competitive in the foreign market. Yeah, and then of course the other big value to a carbon tax is that it, instead of costing money like the electricity payment plan would have, it yields money, right? The fossil fuel companies are the ones being taxed, and so that means that we can make choices about what to do with the revenues, and some of that revenue can go back to individual households and help them deal with the rising energy costs, which are going to be a temporary phenomenon as we transition, because the fossil fuel companies will simply pass that tax along, right? So.
Okay, a couple other questions, more on the technical side. Let me pop down here because I saw a note come in from Mr. Eustace. He was actually interested in what mix, how much wind and how much solar you think there needs to be or will be.
Between wind and solar, how much of each?
Yeah, yes.
That's it's going to depend. It's going to vary a lot regionally, depending on, because the wind and solar resources are concentrated in very different parts of the country. So different grids in different part of the country will rely more on wind or more on solar. Wind definitely has the advantage right now. It got deployed a lot faster. I think we're now up to something like 10% of the grid is wind energy in the US, whereas solar is still low. It's only 2 or 3%, something like that. But whatever mix works. It does seem as though the solar panels, at least right now, suffer from some supply chain problems, suffer from some raw material issues. Mining of metals could be environmentally hazardous. Wind doesn't suffer from that. Also, wind can be built offshore, and it's important to note that some of those land issues can be mitigated with a lot more wind offshore. And if you think about making fossil fuel communities whole, the United States has about 1.2 terawatts of power capacity right now, and another full 0.5 terawatts, almost half as much more, can come only from offshore wind, only in the Gulf of Mexico, where we have all the offshore oil going on. So all the companies and all the workers who are out there who are working in the oil extraction industry offshore, they have the expertise to build all those offshore wind terminals and turn the economy of Louisiana, say, into a green economy. So, it's going to vary.
Yeah, I for one like that idea. Okay, many people have gotten really specific about how to approach our advocacy. My favorite is, how can we get the solutions to climate change the nonpartisan?
Well, there is a lot of common ground. And the problem, what we have now is we have a problem of tribalism in our politics, so that the only way to pass anything is with reconciliation. And because many groups in the Democratic Party rightfully recognize that we need to do a lot of social policy, it's getting lumped together. And so I can tell you, there are Republicans in the Senate and the House who would be open to carbon pricing if it were not for the fact that it's bundled in this way, and because they're sort of, they don't have courage. There's no doubt about it, but they're captive to this tribal politics. There's a lot of common ground on land use. We've done, in the Trump administration, we had several huge land conservation bills passed. Funds that preserve open spaces massively increased. So that's an area where we can both work with the climate, work with preserving land. Yes, we're going to dedicate some land for fishing and hunting to satisfy those groups, but it's going to be a net win, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, building out renewable is a lot of money for that. The real issue is the lockhold of the fossil fuel industry through the dark money network on the Republican Party, and the leadership of the Republican Party. And, they're losing, but we need to make sure they lose faster.
Yes. Thank you. So we have time for about one more question before we move on. I think I'm going to go for two here because I'm so intrigued with what your answer would be to this. Wendy Lawton would like to know, if you could make one statement to world climate leaders at the COP, what would it be?
Wow, that's a heck of a question.
Read my book might be a good one.
Think about posterity. I dedicated this book to the young people in my life, and I mean it. And we don't have the moral right to mess up the planet for future generations. Take note of the fact that this is doable, that we know exactly what to do to get this problem solved. And all, these roadmaps to 2050, they're not using, this futuristic technology about going to net negative and direct air capture and all of that stuff, right? Even energy storage is not that far off if we keep nuclear in the mix for a little while. So, those two things, right?
All right, thank you. We talked earlier about Wyden and Merkley not being on board with real carbon storage and uptake by forests. Is Biden also having mixed messages about storing carbon in forests?
I'm not aware that our senators are in any way not fully supportive of storing carbon in forests. I think they are. I'm just, as from a scientific point of view, I'm pointing out here that the amount that can be stored is limited, and the benefit to the climate is going to plateau. That doesn't mean we shouldn't get everything we can out of it, right? And I know of nothing that the president have said, or either of our senators have said, that takes away from their commitment to want to store carbon on land.
All right, I will let you and Catherine talk to each other because I think her approach is for it to be more aggressive than it is. And,
I
you know,
probably would disagree with that.
yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to pop up to the first question that came in tonight because Nancy Hedrick gave us such a nice segue to our next phase of this program. Thank you so much, John, for spending the time to talk with us and help educate us. I have the book on pre-order, and I'm really looking forward to that. But Nancy's question was, she belongs to many local climate change groups, but she's not heard much about what kinds of two issues. One, that Representative Schrader is ramping up to oppose a skinny Build Back Better bill. Apparently there was some ad campaign that was trying to sway his vote. And also Betsy Johnson got a semi-endorsement from the Portland Tribune as a moderate for governor, even though she voted against climate-related measures. Why aren't we being asked to contact friends in Schrader's district or to write the Tribune? Do such responses fit into your model?
Wow.
Well, I'm not going to
think,
ask, I'm not going to expect you to answer that whole question because Brittany Van Sitters has an activity for us because we do think that makes a difference.
well, I think I should leave this question to Brittany then, and just thank you and everyone else for hosting me tonight. It makes a big difference for me. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, John. We're so happy to have you here and so excited to get our hands on that book and read it and distribute it as widely as we can. I think it will be, after having sat through your lectures that you did for us at McMinimum School, I'm sure the book is very approachable for lay readers and I'm jazzed about it. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. I tried to hit, so we at least covered the topics you were interested in. But we do need to move on because sometimes when we talk about climate, we start to feel a little overwhelmed. And I think the best solution to feeling a little overwhelmed is to have an action. So we wanted to be sure to give all of you an opportunity to take action right now, tonight, without a lot of difficulty because Brittany's done all the groundwork for us. So I'm going to turn this over to Brittany Van Sitters, who's an organizing manager with OLCV and a great advocate for climate change action. Thank you very much, Brittany.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you're frustrated and anxious, channel that into some action. And as John mentioned earlier with the Build Back Better Act, it includes some really transformational investments in our communities, some good paying jobs here in the US, climate action, among other really great policies. So Congress is actually planning to vote on that bill next week, and we really need to make sure that this bill passes. So asking everyone to write a letter to the editor or an LTE to the Oregonian and your local newspaper. LTEs are a really great tool to publicly thank our climate champions like Senators Wyden and Merkley and some of our Congress people. And it also reassures them that the voters really have their back when they go to make these really big votes. And it also adds some pressure to the more moderate elected leaders to do the right thing for their districts. And so even though most of Oregon's congressional delegation is already supportive of the Build Back Better Act, like I said, it's still really important to make our support known for everyone to see so that they feel that support. And especially if you live in Congressman Schrader's district, he needs to hear from you. He has not committed to voting for this bill. So the more constituents that he hears from over the next several days, the more likely he is to vote in favor. So OLCV has put together a toolkit to help you write either your own LTE, or I've also drafted a template that's super easy for you to personalize if that works better for you, or if you don't have a whole lot of time, the template is there for you. But I'm also available to help if you want to write your own. I'm here to answer questions, help with editing, proofreading, whatever it is that you need. So I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. And then if you have friends in Congressman Schrader's district, so places like Milwaukee, Lake Oswego, Oregon City, Westland, Salem, the Central Coast, Tillamook, McMinnville, tons of other places, please share this toolkit with them and encourage them to write their own letter to the editor, or at the very least call him or email him. Make sure that he knows that people in his district support this legislation. It's a really critical time for his district to speak up. So yeah, and if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I will pass things over to KB for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, everybody. We are 10 minutes away from 8 o'clock, so we finished just a little bit early, and we are going to leave everything open and the chat up for about 5 more minutes, because there's information in there we want you to be able to copy and paste or write down. The information in the chat is how to pre-order the book, how to contact John, how to get to the website, how to contact MCATs, the information that Brittany just put up there, her toolkit. And we are going to send everybody an email follow-up, which will contain certain things like where you could view the recording of this, information on the live book launch at Lucky Lab that John is going to have later this month, and anything else you need, including how to contact us. If there's anything that that you still need that we have not provided, please send us an email to info.mcat.olcv@gmail.com. And lastly, I want to encourage you to join MCATs and or any other of the wonderful groups in Portland that are doing advocacy. I want to stress to you that while John is an expert, I am an actor. I know nothing. And I just want to encourage you that there is a place for you, no matter what level of expertise you have in advocacy. And we'd love to have you as an MCAT if you're interested. So with that, I just want to thank everybody so very much for coming. And again, we will stay up for about 5 minutes so that you can get information from the chat. Thank you again.